Advocates webinar on Who's Doing the Work, Shifting the Lift in Math. We're really excited to have everyone with us tonight, and we're going to hold on for just a couple of minutes and allow everyone to get logged on and settled in. So we'll be starting in just a few minutes, but while you're waiting, we would encourage you to download the handouts for tonight's webinar. We'll be referring to those during the course of the webinar. And also while you're waiting, we're going to ask you to participate in a brief poll that gives us a little bit of a better sense of who's on the webinar with us tonight. So we'll be getting started in just a couple minutes.
Great. So it looks like the majority of participants joining us tonight will be first-timers. We're excited to have you and hope you come back again. And for everyone who's come to multiple webinars, we're excited to have you here again and hope that you enjoy the content tonight.
Awesome. Well, once again, everyone, welcome, and thank you for joining us on tonight's webinar. We're really excited to have all of you with us. My name is Joni Funderburk, and I work on the Field Impact team at Student Achievement Partners, and I'm joined by several members of my team, Sandra Alberti, Janelle Fan, and Jenny Beltramini, and also by three additional guests, Marnie Greenstein from Student Achievement Partners Math team, as well as Melissa Higgins and Jamie Massey, who are our core advocate guests tonight. So we're all excited to share some great information with you on our webinar tonight. Since so many of you are new to our webinar series, I just want to take a moment to describe who Core Advocates are. We are a national group of educators who believe in the potential of college and career-ready standards to prepare all students for college and careers. And this group is eager to support their colleagues in their communities in understanding and advocating for standards and standards-aligned instruction, as well as embracing the shifts in instruction and assessment that are required by these college and career-ready standards. If you're not familiar with the Core Advocates program and you'd like to learn more, feel free to contact me directly or Jenny. Our email addresses are on this slide for you. You can also complete a brief survey to join our database, and you'll find that on our website, achievethecore.org. We are on Twitter. Student Achievement Partners tweets at @AchieveTheCore. We encourage those of you who tweet to join us and tweet your learning tonight live using #CoreAdvocates. We've also put up the Twitter handles of all of tonight's presenters who are on Twitter, so we would love for you to tag us in your comments and follow us so we can also hear about the great work that you're doing in your settings. There'll be a couple of ways tonight that we're going to ask you to engage with us. During the webinar, you will want to access the documents, the handouts that are included. You should see a handouts tab on your control panel, and you can go ahead and download those documents that are there now or anytime throughout the webinar. We'll also ask you to answer some questions to engage with us in that way. So you'll use the questions tab on your control panel and just shoot your questions to us at any time, or also use that to shoot your responses to us to the questions that we're going to ask you. And then we'll also complete some polls, one of which you might have just engaged in here on the opening. And as you saw, those will just pop up on your screen, and all you'll need to do is click on your response. After the webinar, you'll receive a survey from us. We are very interested in your feedback, and we use our participant feedback each month to adjust our webinars to better suit your needs. And you'll also receive a link that gives you access to the recording of tonight's webinar, as well as all the handouts and the slide deck, so you can share this information with your colleagues that might not have been able to join us tonight. For those of you that have worked with core advocates in the past, you know that one of the things that we talk about regularly is instructional advocacy. And we'll be talking about that tonight too, because what we hope is that you'll take what you learn on tonight's webinar and actually apply some of these ideas in your setting. And when you do that, we would love to hear how it goes. We'd love to hear what you did. We'd love to hear the impact that it had. So instructional advocacy refers to educators owning, supporting, and promoting the resources, tools, and practices that create the learning environments where students can develop college and career readiness. So that's what we're talking about. It's the work that all of you are doing out in your schools. And we have a special form that we ask you to fill out. There's a link here at the bottom of the slide that just asks a few brief questions about the work that you're doing, and we appreciate you sharing that with us so we can celebrate all of you and all of the hard work that we know you do every day in your classrooms, in your schools, and in your districts with students. So with all of that front matter behind us, let's get started on tonight's webinar. We have three main goals for you tonight. We'd like to start by sharing with you how the Instructional Practice Guide identifies the components of a math classroom where students are engaged and learning mathematics. So that will be our initial frame of reference. And then we'll dive a little bit more deeply into recognizing what a classroom actually looks and sounds like when students are holding the majority of the cognitive lift. And finally, we'll consider some instructional practices and adjustments that might need to be made to them so that we're shifting the cognitive lift back to students when it's a little bit off there. So let's go ahead and dive right into the first part of the webinar where we're going to answer this question: how does the Instructional Practice Guide, or IPG, help teachers understand and create a classroom where students are actively engaged in meaningful mathematics? And to talk about this part, I'm excited to turn it over now to my colleague, Marnie Greenstein.
Thank you, Joni. So we're going to start by talking about the Instructional Practice Guide. If you've interacted with Student Achievement Partners before, been on our website, or worked with some of our partner organizations, you've probably learned about and maybe used the IPG. This is a tool that defines instructional practices that are aligned to the shifts and standards. It is designed as a coaching and self-reflection tool, and it's organized into three core actions, which are broad statements about observable actions in a classroom. And then each of the core actions has specific indicators that name teacher and or student behaviors that are present in the classroom. We'll be using the IPG to frame our discussion of what teacher actions support student engagement in mathematical work. And if you're not familiar with the IPG or you're interested in learning more about it, we have lots of resources to support the IPG on Achieve the Core, including PB modules that introduce the Instructional Practice Guide, and our brand new Instructional Practice Toolkit, which dives deep into 3 different lessons and uses the IPG as framing for it. So, as I mentioned, the IPG is organized into 3 core actions. And core action number 1 is always the starting point. So does the instruction reflect the shifts required by the standards? Specifically, are students engaging in grade level content, targeting the aspects of rigor required by the standard, and connecting mathematical concepts and skills within and across grades? And although on this webinar, we're not talking explicitly about core action 1, we're taking as a given that all of the student engagement with mathematics that we're talking about is about grade level standards. I think sometimes there ends up being a false dichotomy about activities that really engage students aren't necessarily tied to standards. And so you could imagine a really engaging third grade lesson where all the students are discussing probability and grappling with fractional reasoning through an experiment with M&Ms and picking them out of a bag. And, you know, there's a lot of probably mathematical thinking that's happening. There might be some cognitive lift. Students are doing math, but they're not doing grade level math, and it's not meeting grade level expectations, which means it's not going to engage students in a way that will really help them be college and career ready. So with that caveat aside, knowing that we're talking all about engaging students in grade level math, we're going to zoom into core action 3, which is where the opportunity to really put the cognitive lift of mathematical learning onto students lives. So when we think about core action 3, there's a strong connection, Joni, if you could flip to the next slide, between engaging students in mathematical thinking and the expectations of the standards for mathematical practice. So when we look at the work of core action 3, we see the standards for mathematical practice represented in the language of the indicator. This very funky arrow on the slide is meant to show that there's not a one-to-one correspondence between the standards for mathematical practice and the indicators in core action 1. There's 7 indicators and there's 8 mathematical practices. And the reason for this is because not all the mathematical practices are easily observable in instruction, and some of them, so in our indicators, some of the mathematical practices have been combined or they've been extended into several indicators, but all of the math practices live in the indicators of core action 3. So that being said, when students are truly engaging in the mathematical practice, we see the cognitive lift shift from students to teachers. And so one nice thing about how core action 3 is set up is when you look at each indicator, there are both teacher and student actions there. And as you'll hear throughout the webinar, you know, we believe everybody on this webinar came because we can all nod our heads around the importance of student engagement and students doing the work. And we want to see that in our classrooms, but it's hard, and it really only happens when teachers are intentional about setting it up. So the teacher sections of the indicators in core action 3 are a really good starting point for thinking about how do we set up engagement in mathematics for our students in our classrooms. We're going to dive more into these indicators. So if you haven't already pulled up the instructional practice guide, the IPG, from your handouts, please do that and take a look at core action 3. And I'm going to hand it over to Janelle for our poll question.
Hi. For our second poll, we're asking which indicators in core action 3 lead to students doing the work in a math classroom? Please select all answers that apply, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Now, can we go ahead and show them results? All right, so just as we expected, you all caught our trick question in thinking about all of these as indicators that students are doing the work in the math classroom. And we really feel like that is reflected in all of the indicators within core action 3. We're going to dive into a couple of classroom vignettes just to see how that plays out and how it relates to students doing the mathematical work. So the first snippet is a strong example of indicator 3E. The teacher connects and develops students' informal language to precise mathematical language. I'll give everyone a minute just to read that interaction. And this is one that we particularly wanted to highlight in thinking about engaging students in mathematical work. In some classrooms, precise mathematical vocabulary becomes an obstacle to students engaging with the math if we're expecting students to only be able to express things in exactly precise terminology. So this idea of the teacher connecting students' language to precise mathematical language really engages students, encourages ideas, encourages those not quite fully formed ideas so that students are doing the mathematical work. On our next clip, we see Maria, and Maria gives an answer that says, Maddie's answer is correct since her partial products match what I have in my area model. Lydia forgot to adjust her place value when you use the standard algorithm, so her answer isn't right. And we like this one because a lot of times the evidence of these indicators don't actually involve teachers at all. We're hearing that student work, and here we're seeing 3D really at play. So the teacher has created conditions for student conversations where students are encouraged to talk about each other's thinking. So this idea of being a student in my classroom means you're not just responding to me as a teacher, but you're mostly responding to the other students and their mathematical ideas and building off of them. I think one of the things that we all know is we would love to have a classroom full of Marias, but that's not how students necessarily come to us. So later in the webinar, we'll share some ideas about how to create classrooms where students develop and talk authentically about each other's thinking in order to deepen the conversation and their understanding of the mathematics. And our last little example, again, we're going right to what the students are doing. So Caleb's saying, I noticed that in each row of the metric table, the number on the left is 10 times as much as the one on the right. That's like our base 10 system. It's 10 times more each time we shift. And here we're really seeing, we don't see the teacher move again, but you can imagine that the teacher posed high quality questions that allowed students to share their developing thinking about the content of the lesson, which is indicator 3A. So it really comes down to the types of questions we're asking students. And in this example, you can see it's very clearly related to fourth grade content expectations within the NBT strand. If you're interested in learning more about this activity, these snippets come from an activity that's included in your downloads that's called the Core Action 3 Card Sort, which is a really powerful PD activity for discussing Core Action 3, the indicators of what you're looking for in a classroom where students are engaged in meaningful mathematics, and teacher actions that support that classroom.
All right, thank you, Marnie. I think the IPG gives us some great grounding in thinking about how to set up our classrooms and the teacher moves and student moves that really reflect authentic student engagement with meaningful mathematics. So let's dive a little bit more into what this actually looks like and what we're talking about when we're talking about students holding the majority of the cognitive lift. So I want to just pause for a minute here and give you an opportunity to read this quote from Richard Elmore's work on the instructional core. I included this quote in tonight's webinar because I think that many of us as students experienced math class really passively, with a teacher talking and explaining at the front of the room and students listening, hopefully listening, and perhaps even copying down the things that the teacher was writing on the board. In many classrooms across the country, this continues to be the norm. And there's research that supports the extensive use of teacher lecture in math classrooms. And this is particularly true when we talk about middle and high school classrooms. We know that this definitely isn't intentional on the teacher's part. They're not trying to take the cognitive lift away from students by following this model, but it is what we were used to and can be difficult to think about instruction in a different way. In the era of college and career-ready standards, the opportunity for students to engage meaningfully with important mathematics is increasingly important. We know that because of the shifts required by the standards, a balanced approach with equal emphasis on conceptual understanding, procedural skill and fluency, and application is required. And we know that students' deep understanding of the major work of the grade is crucial to their success in math across the grades. So when considering the most important mathematics at each grade level, we want to be increasingly sure that we are shifting the lift and ensuring that students are engaged in active learning. Like Marnie alluded to earlier, we want to be sure that the talking that students are doing and the thinking that students are doing and the productive struggle is based on grade level work, and ideally that most important work of the grade level. So it's actually deeply preparing them for the building upon that work in future grades. So here we have the Charlie Brown slide with the famous wah, wah, wah of the Charlie Brown teacher going. And I wanted to share this quote from an article by Stephen Reinhardt called Never Say Anything a Kid Can Say. This article was published by NCTM many years ago. I think we've all been in classrooms where the teacher does all of the talking and the students do all of the listening. And as Reinhardt suggests here in this quote, the person who's doing the majority of the talking in the classroom is likely also the person doing the majority of the learning. This issue is even more problematic in classrooms where students are historically low achieving. In 1970, a researcher named Flanders reported that teachers of high achieving students spent about 55% of the class time talking, compared with, excuse me, 80% for teachers of low achieving students. I know that during my 20 years as a classroom teacher, I found this article one of the most helpful in addressing my tendency to do all of the talking. Again, it's a real easy trap for teachers to fall into. I think one of the other issues that lead to teachers owning more of the cognitive lift than students is this idea of student struggle. No teacher likes to see their students struggle, and many of us have seen or have been the teacher whose instinct is to jump right in and help as soon as students experience any sort of difficulty. It can be uncomfortable and unpleasant, and our very nature as teachers is to want to make it easier and more enjoyable for our students. We know, however, that productive struggle is an important and necessary part of students learning mathematics. In Principles to Actions, NCTM includes supporting productive struggle as one of its 8 math teaching practices. And there's lots of data to prove that this kind of struggle has long-term benefits for students and their learning. It's important, though, that we're not just talking about struggle for struggle's sake. It's not just about giving students something difficult so that they'll struggle with it. It's about the right kind of struggle at the right time and in the right amounts, and connected to the right mathematics that actually results in high levels of student learning.
Thanks, Joni. So I think the question here is, as you reflect on a recent learning experience, what means of engagement best supported your learning? Please use the question tab on the right to your control panel and answer the question. We look forward to hearing from you.
Webinar tonight, we will send some of those out in the question tab so you can all see what everyone responded. But as I'm looking over the responses, I'm seeing 2 themes about what learning experiences best supported all of your learning. And one theme is collaboration, group work, discussion, being able to work with others. And the other theme that I saw a lot was hands-on, active learning, manipulative, getting to just do the task yourselves. So thinking about how we can continue to shift the cognitive lift of students in the classroom, thinking about those experiences that as adults have worked for us in terms of our learning, and how we are able to structure those collaborative group discussion type learning environments where students are actively working with manipulatives and hands-on doing the mathematics. So thank you for your responses. So we are going to continue to think about shifting the lift to students, the cognitive lift in the classroom. And before a teacher can address the issues of students owning the cognitive lift in a classroom, he or she must first have a sense of what's currently happening in the classroom. So just like teachers typically start where students are at and build from there when teaching new content, teachers can also start where they currently are in their classroom and their instructional practice and improve their practice from there. So first, you're going to need to determine what method or methods to use to collect data on the current status of your classroom, as well as which tool or tools you're going to use to assess the current state of student engagement. So if you're a classroom teacher, or if you work with a classroom teacher interested in assessing how much of the cognitive list your students are owning, a method of data collection you might consider is having a peer or a coach observe you in your classroom. Or you could simply record yourself on video or even audio recording and review what's happening in the classroom without bringing someone else in. So core action 3 of the instructional practice guide, which Marnie already talked to us about quite a bit, is an excellent resource for this kind of review, allowing the teacher or the observer to identify the indicators that are or are not at work within a classroom or a lesson. And when I was a teacher, I used this tool. I reflected on video of my own teaching, and right away I noticed that indicator B was a strength of mine. Students were doing lots of explaining and justifying their own work, but indicator 3D was something that I knew that I could work on after reviewing video of my classroom, that I could continue to work more on promoting conversation and student reflection on their peers' work. So this is a great tool to use to collect some data and reflect on your own classroom. Another thing is, if a teacher is looking for more specific data about student engagement, other tools could also be helpful. So simply tracking the amount and % of time during the class that the teacher is talking and that the students are talking, or using a seating chart to track teacher to student and student to student interactions could provide really useful information. Or maybe the questions asked by the teacher and by the students could be evaluated, as could the responses to the question asked. So these could be recorded by a coach or a peer or on video or audio, and a teacher could gain better insight about their own patterns of behavior, including those that are unintentionally taking the lift and the thinking away from students. And just think about when we're in the moment of teaching, it's hard to be reflective and to notice behaviors. So capturing data on notes or audio or video allows us to see objective data and reflect after that in the moment lesson. So we're going to move on now to part 3 of our webinar, which is thinking about what instructional practices can be used or adapted to shift the cognitive lift of students. So once we kind of have a tool to use and we've taken stock of our current status in our classroom, what can we do to improve our practice around that? And so Janelle's going to actually start us off on a question, which is going to help us think about obstacles.
So what obstacles do teachers face in shifting the lift in math to students? Please use your question tab to answer the question.
Great, thank you so much again for all of your answers. Many of the responses that I'm seeing are exactly the ones that that we were able to brainstorm and think about prior to the webinar tonight. I see lots of people responding: time, prerequisite math content knowledge that students might be lacking, needing to get through content. So all of those are also obstacles that we were able to think about in terms of what teachers might be facing in their classrooms. So we're going to move on and continue talking about common obstacles. As we've been saying throughout the webinar, we know that Most teachers are not intentionally taking the cognitive lift away from their students. All of you on the webinar tonight are here because you want to get better at shifting the cognitive lift of students. So we know that all teachers believe that students need to engage with mathematics to learn. We also know that teaching is a really complex and difficult task, and oftentimes the issues we struggle with in our classrooms are having the unintended consequence of negatively impacting students' authentic engagement with mathematics. So we appreciate your responses to the question about obstacles. Like I said, we made a list of those we find common in our experiences in our own classrooms and in working with teachers. And so on the screen are some of the most common obstacles. And the first one was the one that I saw probably the most responded tonight, which was teachers feeling pressed for time. We also, I know that Joni already mentioned this, but feeling uncomfortable with struggle, both teachers and students being uncomfortable with struggle. Even teachers having their own math experiences as students themselves, being taught that math is a set of rules and procedures, and students and teachers being used to being taught that way. And even teachers sometimes can be uncomfortable, and I would say even administrators in some cases who are observing teachers being uncomfortable with a classroom that's loud and boisterous, and the feeling that student engagement means students sitting quietly and working on schoolwork quietly. So we're going to unpack some of these obstacles a little bit more deeply and think about, if the goal is to shift the lift to students, how can teachers overcome some of these obstacles in their classrooms? So the third handout that you hopefully were able to download tonight is a note catcher, or sort of a brainstorming document. We would encourage you to take notes on it tonight on the webinar, but after the webinar, you might also think about spending some time reflecting on what are the obstacles you face, and they might be the ones that are on the note catcher, or you might add some of your own, and think about strategies for overcoming those obstacles and resources that can help you. And we even would encourage you to spend some time with your colleagues in a PLC or a grade level or department group thinking about this together. So please feel free to download this note catcher and use it for yourself and also with your colleagues. So this is just an example of one of the rows on the note catcher, but we picked time because we knew that that was a big one, and turns out it was. So teachers might feel pressed for time and feel like it's faster and easier to go through the content directly. So it's important to acknowledge that these obstacles are real and consider strategies for addressing them in ways that support student learning rather than taking high levels of thinking out of their hands. So in order to address the time issue, for instance, teachers could use the shift of focus and coherence to ensure that they're allowing the most time for the most important mathematics, and ensuring that as students engage with the major work of the grade, the connections to other math concepts is made explicit in their work. So these connections not only help reduce the amount of time students may require to make sense of the math, they also allow for students to better understand and better remember the mathematics from one lesson, 1 week, one school year to the next. It does take more time to deeply into the math, so it's important that teachers are strategic about spending more time on the right math and in the right ways. So you can find tools on Achieve the Core to help teach with focus and coherence, such as the focus by grade level documents and the coherence map. So high quality math tasks can help teachers with instruction around major concepts of their grade and how it connects to other important content. Rich math tasks can be natural places where students will have discussion, rich thinking, rich conversation, and be able to really engage in deeply. So there are tasks to do this on both Achieve the Core and on Illustration's website. Obstacle that many teachers might face is that teachers and students think math instruction is being told the rules and procedures and engaging in rote practice. So we know that that challenge that many teachers have simply a lack of experience with a student-centered style of teaching. Many of us experience math instruction with a teacher at the front of the room providing definitions, rules, processes, and examples that we were expected to copy down and parrot back. We often weren't given time and the opportunity to share our thinking or to work deeply with other students on a rich task ourselves as learners. So this type of instruction is common in math classrooms at all grade levels across our country, and it's often the only kind of math instruction our students have even received. Lack of experience with students owning the cognitive lift is a struggle for teachers and students alike. As teachers, we may need to create a space for our own learning of new strategies that can support our students. We'll need to try out and refine classroom strategies that encourage students to take more ownership and responsibility for their learning and help them to get comfortable with this if they aren't in the classroom. There are lots of resources to help math teachers engage students in talking about their mathematical thinking, such as Sherry Parrish's Number Talks books and articles available on NCTM, but even simple routines like Think, Pair, Share, or use of partners and collaborative groups, or even just providing a few moments for students to write down a response before being asked their thinking others, along with in the list and instructional work around for students to make mistakes and how to honor them and use them as teachable moments. Additionally, setting the expectation that students will revise, refine, and rework their methods helps to shift the cognitive lift to students. So we went through two note taker, the common obstacles and strategies chart, to think through on your own also some of the strategies and tools and resources you can use or your colleagues can use to help shift the lift of students. So now I'm super happy to introduce our first Core Advocate guest, Melissa Higgins. And Melissa, I'm going to let you introduce yourself to our audience.
Hello, everybody. My name is Melissa Higgins, and I'm a 7th grade math teacher at Murphy Creek P8 in Aurora, Colorado. And as I thought about obstacles that I face in my own classroom and my classroom's focus, I really found myself focusing on a few things that really not only are things that I struggle with every day and I find as challenges in my classroom, but also really define my classroom. And I find myself really focused as a teacher on teaching my students to be 21st century learners, along with focusing on the math practices. And in that, I found that the first thing that I see as an obstacle, but also as something that I define my classroom as, is that belief in all students, that they can access the curriculum and that they have something valuable to contribute to the conceptual understanding of the whole class. And so I really feel like each kid has a puzzle piece that makes for the overall learning of all students to be successful. And it's my job as an educator to get to know my students and to know those strengths, and then really showcase those strengths within my classroom each day in order to build their confidence, but also to build the conceptual understanding of the students in the classroom as well. And then through those strengths, we can use it as a vehicle to access the major work of the grade in order to support all students getting the depth of knowledge that they need in the major work of 7th grade. And then that leads to me to the second obstacle that I find that also defines me as a teacher and defines my classroom, and that's the willingness to be a risk taker as the teacher, as well as asking my students to be the risk takers. And I believe that by leading by example and being okay to show that when I'm not in a comfortable place in my classroom, that real true learning happens. And even though I've planned every day for the lesson and I think I know the strategies and the way that students will approach the task, I always have to be willing to be uncomfortable to accept where my students take the learning and to showcase their thinking and where they're at with the task, and use those moments, even if they are off track, to support all students doing the discovery and the development of that conceptual understanding that I'm looking for. And by supporting and encouraging them to be risk takers, along with showcasing that I'm okay to be uncomfortable and to put the learning in their hands versus being the one driving the learning, it leads to some really awesome, wonderful magic happening in my classroom each day. And then finally, that leads right into the last obstacle that I also feel like really defines my classroom as well. And that's just that balancing time to understand, to get that true depth of knowledge and to have a true conceptual understanding of the major work in 7th grade while still covering the content. And so I feel like for true conceptual understanding to happen, it takes time. And with that, by moving slow to allow the students to do the discovery and to develop a conceptual understanding, it leads to speed with procedural skill and fluency in the future. And So therefore, I don't spend as much time in the procedural skill and fluency because they're able to get that depth of knowledge by taking the time in the conceptual understanding part. And I also just focus a lot on it's about the quality versus the quantity, and just allowing them the time to develop it. And by having that depth of knowledge, they're able to take on new risks and challenges, even if we haven't covered everything in a year in a glance or the pacing guide for the year. And just giving them those opportunities through those rich tasks of the major work in the grade level.
All right. Thank you, Melissa. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise. And I know I've seen a couple of questions coming in that we'll have for you in just a few minutes. But I'd like to now turn it over to our second core advocate guest, Jamie Massey.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Massey. I'm an elementary math TOSA in 4J here in Eugene, Oregon. I started my career as a primary teacher and have spent the last 4 years being a math interventionist. In my role as a TOSA, I'm responsible for supporting our teachers as we transition to a new math curriculum that actually calls on this kind of shifting the lift in our classrooms. So when I reflected on my own journey, I really took some hints from the way that I had raised kind of my primary students and my students in intervention on the idea that if our students don't trust us, they really can't do this work. And really taking some time to intentionally build community where they will learn to trust each other. And I needed to do that in a way that they could take risks and that they could do that safely. So we actually use a OER by Positive Engagement project called Acing Math. And it's a PDF of games that go from preschool all the way through middle school. And so as an interventionist, I could select those games strategically to the type of math that I wanted my students to do. And kids will play. They would form relationships with each other where they will take these risks and they will talk about strategy. And I could kind of hone in on some of the math. One of the things that we could also do then is set up some routines around them talking to each other and having some practice with that and sharing some of their strategies before we really launched into kind of some open task-based work that they maybe really had to kind of dig into. So just this practice of not only building community, but an intentional mathematic community. Something that I haven't used, but I found on the SAP website was a new grade level fluency activities. And I spent a lot of time as an interventionist and a teacher trying to come up with some routines for my students to use. And having these there, I can see us rolling these out because they're just those snippets that I can be more strategic about building their fluency and kind of leverage the ways that I've taught them to play games and to talk to each other. With using these tools, we could also set up routines where students would know how to kind of interact in a mathematics classroom. After we set up our community, I think a lot about the work that I need to do beforehand, before I really work with the task. So I anticipate and collect student strategies in a way that our new curriculum is calling for us to really dig into a task. And so, Joni, if you want to go ahead and go to the next one. So I always talk to teachers as we're doing this work is we have to really do the math. And I think Joni talked a little bit about that earlier, but we really need a chance to brainstorm student strategies. And for new teachers, that's particularly hard because you may not have seen a lot of student strategies. You only have the one that you bring. So in our new curriculum, which is Learn Zillion, we have task implementation guides. But I know the illustrative tasks also have the teacher and student notes that you can leverage, and even textbooks have resources for teachers to really kind of think about the math that students will bring to their classroom. And by kind of doing this work beforehand, you can really focus then in on the questioning or the goal that you have for students. And so one of the ways that that I would use this during the class time then is to have a sequencing system. I actually use sticky notes. I would look around for the math that I had anticipated, and I would draw 1, 2, 3 on the sticky note and hand them out to students in the order. And they're really flexible, so I could, swap ordering and start to think about the questions that I wanted to ask students, and students noticed this. So they would start preparing, knowing that they were second, ways that they could listen to the first person and start to dialogue with each other. I could also use those sticky notes to collect new strategies so that I could kind of build my repertoire of things, and knowing that our standards have this really nice coherence, I could then prepare for future units or even for the next year. So I didn't have to work so hard every year. I could also take those sticky notes and confer with colleagues around the things that they were seeing in their classroom and collect more. Something that I didn't do as often that I would have liked is to take this task implementation guide or the new strategies I had and really save them for later. I know a lot of teachers are recording these things in kind of their planning or in their units, and then they have kind of, again, built in repertoire, but over time. The last thing I think about when I think about shifting the lift is, what if it's not really working? Like, what if I don't see this kind of shift, or I feel uncomfortable with it? And I ask myself that maybe it's really not the math. Maybe it's the access that my students have to the math. I know that it's really important to not lower the rigor of the mathematics. A lot of times as teachers, we don't like to see students struggle, and so it's easy to make the math problem a lot easier, and then we're all successful. But that's not the productive struggle that Joni was talking about, and that really doesn't do a service to our students and keep us in our major work. So I kind of brainstormed some things, and we have a list here of ways that we can really give access to our students to the task by reading it or asking all those clarifying questions, building prior knowledge around concepts or vocabulary, and really getting out tools. Students who have things that are hands-on have another way to engage with the mathematics other than just verbally. I know for students who haven't had a ton of success prior in math in our intervention time, we had to think about people who didn't want to be really vocal. So they used whiteboards or a gallery walk where students would ask, what do you notice? What's one that's like yours? What do you wonder? And really using sentence stems to prompt them and model that vocabulary for them. Something that's newer to us that we're engaging in our district is not waiting till the end of a lesson to do all of the student share, but really to do it midway so that we can revise our thinking along the way and students can build on that thinking.
Thank you, Jamie. There was some great information shared there. I'm just noticing before we move into some questions, and feel free to start typing those into the question box, but several of you are asking about links to resources, and I just want to let you know that all of the resources that we've talked about tonight, as you've seen them named on the slides, those are all hot links, and when you receive the webinar recording, you'll be able to access all of those just by clicking on the name of the resource. So we'll go ahead and just pause for a minute to give you a chance to pose any questions you might have, either for Marnie or for Melissa or for Jamie. So I'm going to start us out with a question that I think might be best for Melissa. One of our attendees was asking about, how do you handle when your administrator doesn't buy into this approach, or even your other teachers in your school, when you're sort of feeling like the lone wolf a little bit? What sort of strategies do you use there? So Melissa, what can you share with us?
That's a great question. I think for me, it's having those conversations to kind of educate either the administrator or a colleague on the value that I see in taking these approaches in my classroom. I also find myself inviting them in, and when I invite them in, I really ask them to sit with the students and participate in the discussions that are happening, and to listen and really be part of the conversation in my classroom in order for them to experience what it feels like to be a student in my classroom, and how that changes the way that students view and feel and see math. And I find that by offering the opportunity to come in and to be a student with the kids and see what math looks like through their eyes has really given the way that I approach teaching math power in my school and even in my district. And just the other piece for me is just really believing that for me, this is what I believe math should be. And I believe that this is what's best for kids. And so just sticking to who I am and what I believe in, even when I am that lone wolf in those situations. But I've really found power in just really inviting some of those people in and asking them to just really be a student alongside and with my students. And that's really given them a different perspective and a different lens to view math through.
I really love that approach, Melissa, like putting them in the learner position. That definitely creates the buy-in of how much more meaningful this approach is. So thank you for that response. I appreciate it. One for Jamie. Jamie, you're in a coaching role, and one of our attendees would like some advice on how you work with reluctant teachers who maybe aren't super excited about thinking about shifts in instruction this way, or maybe haven't bought in that they need to shift their instruction. Can you tell us a little bit about how you handle that?
Yeah, thank you. One of the ways that we've considered that at the district is really kind of focusing a little bit smaller in a lesson. So we're also implementing number talks, and sometimes it's easier to kind of observe or kind of bite off one small thing to kind of get a little bit of buy-in and a little bit of response for students and kind of success for a teacher. And so we've considered using that work either kind of using the teaching channel with the videos so the teacher can see it, or doing kind of what Jenny was talking about, offering to come in and give the teacher some data just on what's there, not good, not bad, without judgment, and then let the teacher kind of analyze where they want to be, what they're seeing in comparison to the video, and kind of scaffolding a plan for them. Maybe they want strategic talk moves that they want to try out. Maybe they want to go in and see another teacher and kind of analyze their practice or videotape themselves and work on that. I think in general, it has to be really personal, but I think starting off small is a good piece.
Yeah, that's a great response. Thank you, Jamie. I'm going to combine a couple of questions and direct these at Marnie. There are some questions about what about special education students, and what about students that are English language learners? How do we think about engaging them deeply and shifting the lift for those students that have some special challenges? So Marnie, can you give us some ideas there?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think a lot of times the first approach is thinking that students who have special needs or English language learners need a lot more direct instruction. And I recently was at a PD by a professor at Chapman University named Rachel Lambert, who does a lot of research focusing specifically on special ed and mathematics education. And she did a meta-analysis of research out there and found that there aren't even very many research studies about using kind of more open-ended instruction with students with special needs. They're all about direct instruction. So we don't even have a research base to know that direct instruction is the correct way, but a lot of people default to that. And I think a big piece here is really thinking about how these strategies can help students access content and take ownership are even more important for students who are struggling or having gaps or who have special needs. I would suggest checking out Stanford University's Understanding Language project has math language routines, which are specifically designed to engage English language learners in discussion of mathematics and in mathematical learning, and do a great job of thinking about how language development happens hand in hand with content development, and would be really powerful strategies for engaging students.
All right, thanks, Marnie. And I'll be sure we get links to those resources that Marnie mentioned so that all of you can have access to them afterwards and dive in a little bit more after the webinar. So one last question. Jamie, we're getting a lot of questions about your task implementation guide. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, actually, so the curriculum that we implemented here in 4J is LearnZillion, and each of the conceptual or application lessons are tasks and have a matching task implementation guide that has both student work for students who are kind of on target with their thinking and those with some unfinished learning. And so for our teachers implementing this work, that's been really key to give them some insights into the things that they might see in their classroom for a new curriculum.
Great, thank you. And the tasks on Achieve the Core have some similar supports in place as well. So thanks everybody for your great questions. Unfortunately, we are running out of time.
Can I add one question, Josie?
Oh, yeah,
Jenny,
go
can
ahead.
I add one question? This is Sandra, and I'm going to throw this question to you, actually, because I saw several people wondering, and I know when we visualize this idea of student engagement and conversations around math, we often think about our K-5 and sometimes our middle school, but I know we had a few questions about, hey, could you really do this in a high school? And I know that's where your passion and experience lies, so I wonder if you could just address the relevance of this conversation to high school math students.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's just as important in high school and maybe even more so. And high school brings its own unique challenges, partly because the complexity of the content or the abstractness of the content also leads teachers to that same false conclusion that Marnie mentioned about students with special needs. Like we think, oh, because this mathematics is really complex, it's easier or it's more important for me as the teacher to just tell students, just to give them the direct information. I also think that, just socially, I think this is true at middle school too, it's super challenging for students to feel comfortable talking and sharing their developing thinking. So I know for me, I taught high school for nearly 20 years and have done a lot of work in supporting high school teachers. And I think the most important aspect of helping make this shift to the cognitive lift is building those relationships and creating a culture of safety within the classroom so that students know that the classroom is a place where we're all learning together. I know I often would start school by saying, you're not supposed to know the answers to the math that we're doing. If you already knew the answers, you wouldn't be in this class. So I think a lot of the things that we've talked about, the approaches and the importance of it, is just as relevant in high school as it is anywhere else. So thank you for that question, Sandra. I love the chance to talk about my passion. So before we wrap up, we would encourage all of you to take a look at the indicators of Core Action 3 of the Instructional Practice Guide and really think about, why is it that you tuned into tonight's webinar and what is it, that you would like to shift in your own classroom so that students are owning more of the cognitive lift. So we would really encourage you to set some intention around what you'd like to do as a result of having attended tonight, thinking about what evidence you could collect. And then, of course, I don't know that it came out often enough, but the whole purpose of all of the instructional shifts and this concept of shifting the lift is about student achievement. So thinking about what you could do to measure the impact of your changes on student learning and really collect that real-time data and action research about what's working for you, what's working for your students. So before we wrap up, I just want to remind you one more time that we are all about instructional advocacy, that idea of setting an intention for yourself around utilizing the information you learned tonight, and then sharing that with us. We'll be following up with you in a few weeks to hear about what you did and encouraging you to complete our instructional advocacy action form to tell us all about it. And then finally, we hope that, especially for those of you that were joining us for the first time tonight, that you'll continue to join us for our Core Advocate webinars and share the information about these webinars with a friend. Next month, we'll be doing a similar webinar on who is doing the work shifting the lift in literacy. So please encourage your literacy colleagues, or for those of you that teach both math and literacy, we hope that you'll be able to join us again next month. And once again, you'll get information, all of the webinar resources tonight, and that link will be live, so you can just click on it to register. So on behalf of my Student Achievement Partners colleagues and our special guest tonight, I just would once again like to thank everybody for joining us, and we hope you have a great night.